All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in another one of our fabulous webinars. We are pleased to have Freba Jalal and Jordan Allen, who are both associates from Miller Thomson, joining us on today's webinar. During this next hour, Freba and Jordan will share some of the important issues that we should consider when deciding whether or not to incorporate your business. So thank you, Freba and Jordan, for joining us today, and you guys can feel free to start whenever you're ready.
My name is Freba Jalal, and I'm a lawyer with Miller Thomson in Saskatoon. If anybody has trouble hearing, please feel free to type in the chat box. With me this afternoon, I have my colleague Jordan Allen, who is also a lawyer at our Saskatoon office. Between Jordan and I, our practices cover business and corporate law. We deal quite a bit with small and medium-sized businesses in different industries. Our practices also cover nonprofits and charities and wills and estates. Miller Thomson itself is a national law firm, and our office in Saskatoon is one of the 12 offices located in most of the major Canadian cities. Jordan and I are very excited to have this opportunity to speak with you today, and we hope it's a useful session. Today's presentation topic is understanding incorporation. What we aim to cover today is the different types of business entities and the differences between them, and why one entity might work better for you for a certain business you're running over another. And we believe it's important to understand the different entities in order for you to decide whether you should incorporate your business or not. We hope this will give you a starting point in thinking about how you might want to structure your business, whether you have a business ongoing or whether you're thinking about starting one. This should be helpful to you. I would like to mention that the discussions today involve general legal information only. It's not specific legal advice, as we don't know any specifics about any of you attending today. I will be covering the first part of the presentation, and Jordan will cover the second part. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. We will try to answer them as we go if possible, but we might save most of the questions for the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's get started. So common business types, business structures in Saskatchewan. While we talk quite a bit about Saskatchewan and our presentation is focused on the requirements under Saskatchewan law, a lot of the discussions are relevant to other jurisdictions as well, but please note that we are focused mainly on Saskatchewan. So the three main types of business structures are sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations. You will also see a number 4, other, and Jordan will cover briefly a few other structures that you might have heard of, but these are not very commonly used, so we are focusing on the first 3. Each of the business structures are different in terms of startup costs, setup, ongoing administration, practicality, distribution of profits, etc. Okay, for a sole proprietorship, all you need is one owner. Whereas for a partnership, you have to have at least 2 owners, and there's a possibility to have more than one owner. There's really no limit on how many partners you can have. A corporation can have one owner or more than one owner. Again, there's no limit on corporations as to how many owners it can have. If you think of very large publicly traded companies, there can be thousands or millions of shareholders who are what we call owners of the business. So what is a sole proprietorship? In a sole proprietorship, the sole proprietor is the owner of the business. Anyone that runs a business alone which has not been incorporated is really a sole proprietor. There's no minimum or maximum business size limit, but a lot of times sole proprietorships tend to be small businesses. When you run a sole proprietorship, you are self-employed. And that can be advantageous depending on how you see it and the circumstances. So some of the advantages as a sole proprietor, you are the business. So you reap all the rewards and all the benefits of the business directly. If you start your business as a sole proprietorship, which a lot of small businesses tend to be at the beginning, but later on you decide to turn it into a partnership because somebody else wants to join the business, or you wish to incorporate your business, this change can be fairly easily achieved. You of course need to make sure it's papered properly, and that if you are transferring any assets from the sole proprietorship into the partnership or a corporation, that they are done properly. There are rollovers available under the Income Tax Act, so you want to make sure it's done properly. But for the most part, it's a pretty forward change. Sole proprietorships are simple models. The startup costs are fairly low, so it's attractive to most owners, especially startups. All you need to do for the most part is really register your business name. As a sole proprietorship, all of the income earned at the business level is taxed at the hands of the owner, and it goes on the owner's personal income tax. So this can be beneficial if you are the owner and you have losses from other sources to offset against that income. It can also be beneficial if you have business expenses that you can claim. So let's say you are running your business out of your home, you could claim part of your home expenses against your business income. In terms of disadvantages, which is the other column, this is not obviously a requirement under the law or anything, but most sole proprietorships, in most sole proprietorships, the one owner tends to wear many hats and pretty much do everything, which can be hard. But the more considerable disadvantage is the personal liability of the owner. As a sole proprietor, the owner bears all of the liability of the business personally, and it is unlimited liability. So imagine if you are, for example, running a roofing business as a sole proprietorship. You go fix up somebody's roof. A few days later, the roof collapses and damages the entire house, personal belongings in the house, and injures the occupant of the house. If your business is sued, which I would say most likely will be, what that means is that you as the owner of that sole proprietorship are personally sued. And whoever is suing you can go after your personal assets in order to recover damages. So you're exposed to all that personal liability. There is the possibility to get business insurance in place to help with situations like this, but that doesn't mean that you are 100% covered against personal liability. So that can be quite risky and quite daunting for a lot of sole proprietorships, especially a small business. In terms of estate planning for a sole proprietorship, and if you want to pass the business down, it's not the best structure. It's not very tax efficient. There could be quite a bit of taxes at the time the owner dies, and there's not a lot of planning possible for a sole proprietor. It could also mean that if the owner dies, the business sort of dies with the owner. Finally, in terms of taxes, because the business income is taxed at the personal level, if the income is high, especially if the sole proprietor also has income from other sources, because the income goes on the personal income tax of the owner's income can be taxed at the highest rate. So, income arising from sole proprietorship, as I said, is added to your personal income tax. Individuals in Saskatchewan are taxed at 48% for the top. That's the top marginal combined rate of income tax for Saskatchewan. So essentially, you could be paying half your income at the highest rate to CRA, which is not always ideal. And there's not a lot of income splitting options available. Okay, so we will move on to partnerships now. This is the second type of business structure we would like to cover today. The definition of partnership under the law in Saskatchewan is two or more persons carrying on business in common with the view to profit. So let's say today you decide to start a catering business and your friend wants to run the business with you. All you need is the two of you working together to create a partnership. There's nothing really other formal requirements. There's also no limit as to how many partners can join a partnership. So you can admit as many partners as you wish. You do not need a written partnership agreement to create a partnership. Having said that, a partnership agreement can be very, very important. And as lawyers, we can't stress enough the importance of one. So that's kind of under the first advantage, because partnership agreements can be very beneficial for a partnership. If it's drafted properly, the partnership agreement can specify each partner's role, the percentage of contribution they contribute to the partnership, whether it be by way of labor or actual capital contributions, percentage of profits. Because in the absence of an agreement, if there are two partners, they're presumed to share equally in the profits and contribute equally as well. And you might not want that arrangement. A partnership agreement can also address situations where one partner dies. What happens to that partner's share in the partnership? This can be crucial because imagine you start a business with this really good friend, the catering business. Down the road, he passes away. She transfers all her assets through her will to her husband. What that can mean is that you are now in partnership with the husband, whom you may or may not like, or who may or may not be suitable to run this business with you. Through a well-drafted partnership agreement, you can address this situation. Partnership agreements also take care of situations where there's a dispute between partners, or if one partner wants to be out of the business. If you are running, I'm kind of covering the second point under advantages for partnerships. So if you're running a partnership and later on wish to incorporate, again, this change, similar to the sole proprietorship change, can be fairly easily achieved. You still want to make sure it's papered properly. Again, if you have assets in the partnership that you've been using that need to now become assets of the corporation, they need to be rolled over under the proper rollover provisions under the Income Tax Act, so you wouldn't trigger any taxes. But as long as all of that is done properly, it's a pretty straightforward change. Oftentimes what we see is partnerships kind of are the middle step between sole proprietorships and corporations. Sometimes somebody starts a business alone, then they add a partner, and then they grow and they decide to incorporate. You can get some income splitting by going into a partnership, which means each of the partners then takes, let's say, half of the income, and then that half the income gets taxed on that partner's income tax. So let's say if you and your spouse go into a partnership together, each of you will split that income, which means at the end of the day, the taxes could fall under lower tax brackets and you pay less taxes, as opposed to a sole proprietorship where all of the income would go on your income tax alone. Startup costs of partnerships are fairly low as well, although you might want to consider doing a partnership agreement. So that means the cost could be a little bit higher than a sole proprietorship. But other than that, mostly what you need is to register your business and you're good to go as a partnership. So when it comes to disadvantages of partnerships, similar to a sole proprietorship, the partners of a partnership are exposed to unlimited liability. Partners in a partnership are really the business. Just like in a sole proprietorship, the sole proprietor is the business. So in a partnership, the assets of the business have to be registered in the personal name of the partners, and also the partners are personally liable for losses and any other liability of the business. In most situations, partners are actually jointly and severally liable. What that means is, let's say if you are running that roofing business as in partnership with somebody, and you get sued for $1 million, or the partnership has a liability of $1 million, you will each get sued for $1 million, and then the person will see who they can collect from. You can't, in most situations, you can't really say you should be really, you should owe only half of that liability, because that's how partnerships work. I will cover the taxes for partnerships in the next slide. So income of a partner, in a partnership, the income is taxed at the hands of the partners, as I mentioned. What that means that each partner who receives income from the partnership will have to report that income on his or her personal income tax return and pay the taxes accordingly. So depending on how much income the partner earns, there's a possibility to income split, but it could also end up that each partner pays taxes at the highest marginal income tax rate on what amount of income is earned. The taxation is very similar to taxation for sole proprietorship, except here the income is split between the partners. I think I will stop there. Now I'll pass it over to Jordan to cover the next part.
Hi, everyone. So moving on to corporations. A corporation is a creature of statute, meaning that it is derived from legislation. A corporation is a legal entity that is separate and distinct from the individuals and the shareholders or members. So, as Freba mentioned, where a sole proprietorship or a partnership is actually an extension of the individual that operates it, a corporation at law is its own person, which is separate and distinct from the person who incorporated the business. Governing a corporation, there are the shareholders, who are the owners of the corporation, and the shareholders give authority to the directors of the corporation, who manage the day-to-day activities. Often, in a small business, the shareholders will appoint themselves as the directors so that they make all the decisions related to the business. But legally, shareholders and directors are two distinct roles. In Saskatchewan, a corporation can be incorporated provincially under the Saskatchewan Business Corporations Act, or federally under the Canada Business Corporations Act. Once incorporated, the corporation is governed by whichever act under which they incorporated, and the business must comply with all of the rights, responsibilities, and obligations as set out in the legislation. So what are the pros and cons to incorporating? I will start with the cons, which are on the right-hand column of the slides. Corporations do not set up themselves. They could be complex and costly to set up, and they involve filing fees, legal costs, accounting costs, etc. On top of that, there are ongoing costs to maintain your corporation, such as annual returns and filing fees. As well, there are reporting requirements for a corporation that can be costly and time-consuming year after year. For example, a corporation must maintain its corporate documents in a minute book. Those must stay up to date. They must organize annual general meetings, appoint directors and officers, etc., and so forth. The pros, on the left-hand column, the biggest pro to incorporation is the limited liability that shareholders of a corporation have compared to sole proprietors and partnerships. Since, as I mentioned, a corporation is its own person, the liability of the corporation is limited to the extent of the assets of the corporation. In other words, shareholders are not personally liable for the obligations of the business. For example, we'll take Freba's roofing company. If that corporation gets sued, the plaintiff cannot register the judgment against a shareholder's home or car, as may potentially be the case in the sole proprietorship. The plaintiff can only enforce the judgment as against the corporation and its assets. This shield from personal liability is a huge advantage to incorporation and often the main reason that individuals incorporate their businesses. I do want to highlight the little note on the slide at the bottom. Practically speaking, creditors, meaning banks, will invariably, if not always, ask shareholders to sign personal guarantees when a corporation is applying for a loan with a bank. This means that whatever the corporation owes to the bank, the shareholder, as the guarantor, is agreeing to also owe in their personal capacity the amount of the loan. So if the corporation does not pay, the shareholder is on the hook to repay the loan. This is the method that banks use to get around this limited liability advantage, and something as a business owner that shareholders should be aware of. Next, for advantages, corporations are suited entities for estate planning purposes. Where a sole proprietorship dies with the death of the proprietor, a corporation continues its existence regardless of the death of any shareholders. When incorporated, the shareholders have the opportunity to plan for legacy purposes. For example, I have a client who has created a successful business from the ground up. He has aged and now wants to pass the business on to his son, but does not yet want to give up control of the decision-making of the corporation. So what we are doing on his behalf over the course of the next 10 years is issuing small amounts of shares to the son so that he can start to participate in the decision-making of the corporation, but the father remains the controlling shareholder, until such time as the father is comfortable passing the entire control of the business on to his son. Also, it is often easier for corporations to raise capital, and there are more options to do so. Specifically, a corporation can always sell new shares to raise capital, which obviously a sole proprietor cannot. The other main advantage to incorporation is the beneficial tax consequences. The effective tax rate that applies to business income is lower where the business is carried on through a corporation. So as Freba mentioned, when a person owns a sole proprietorship, they simply include whatever income is made in the business on their personal tax returns, which is subject to the normal graduated rate at the highest rate of 48%. A corporation, on the other hand, is taxed separately from its shareholders. So if we use the same example and we have an individual who is an employee at Sobeys and works at Sobeys throughout the day, but runs a small roofing business in the evening, that person will file their earnings from Sobeys on their personal tax return, but their incorporated roofing business will be filed as its own entity and taxed as business income. The combined rate of tax for business income is approximately 27%, which is obviously much lower than the 48% personal tax rate we quoted. Further, eligible businesses in Canada are subject to the small business deduction, which brings the effective business income rate even lower. However, this does not mean that a person is saving 20% in income taxes when they incorporate. Otherwise, no one would operate unincorporated. Businesses are effectively taxed at two levels, the business level and the shareholder level. So as a shareholder of your business, you pay income tax at 27% on the income of the business, and then if and when you distribute that income to yourself as a shareholder, you are taxed again on that income. So effectively, the taxes you pay on the business income come out to the same as personal income. But with the two tax levels, you are provided with a number of tax planning options that are not otherwise available to sole proprietors. For example, there is a strategy called deferring income, which means that a shareholder can leave the profits of the corporation in the corporation and not pay them out to shareholders, such that the income is only taxed at 27%. Then those profits and the tax savings can be used to invest in assets, inventory, and infrastructure of your business without incurring the additional second level of tax. Then the shareholders can strategically time when they want to receive dividends, and those dividends will be taxed again to equalize the tax rate. So, with all of this said, what is the actual process to incorporate? I will not go into detail with respect to each step, but will provide a general overview. And if you have further questions or specific inquiries about incorporation, please make sure to call Freba or I after the presentation. Step 1. The first step is to determine whether you are eligible for incorporation. You have to be over 18, you cannot be in bankruptcy, and you must have capacity. Particularly though, you must determine whether incorporation is right for you and your business. Practically speaking, I usually think of it like this. When your business is saving more than it is earning, incorporation is definitely worth considering, since you can use tax planning options on those savings. However, where you have a startup business that is making, for example, 100K and is spending all 100K so that the business is breaking even, you may be better off operating as a sole proprietor for the first few years to avoid the startup costs associated with incorporation and then reevaluate down the road. Now, that analysis has nothing to do with the limited liability advantage, which is something that must be considered on an individual business basis. Step 2. So you decide, yes, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages and you want to incorporate. This can be done with the help of a lawyer. Particularly, I've heard that Miller Thomson lawyers do incorporations very well, or you can do it yourself if you have the time and the patience. You must determine where you want to incorporate. Do you want to incorporate federally or provincially? Where will you be operating your business? Will your business cross provincial borders? Will you be expanding in the next few years? These are all things to consider in deciding under which act you want to incorporate. Step 3. You need to then do a search for a business name with the corporate registry, and if available, reserve the name. Registration of the business name protects the name from being used, but it is not the same as a trademark. It simply prohibits others from registering the same business name as you in the jurisdiction that the name is registered. There are also restrictions on the names you can register. The name must end in limited, incorporated, company, or any abbreviation thereof, and it must have a distinguishing element and a descriptive element in the name. Step 4, preparing and submitting the incorporation documents to the corporate registry. When you incorporate, you must file articles of incorporation. Think of articles of incorporation like the birth certificate of the company. The articles set forth the name, the classes of shares, the number of directors, and any restrictions of the business that the corporation may carry on. There's also a filing fee to incorporate, which I think is just under $300 when you incorporate in Saskatchewan. Finally, you will submit the application package to ISC, and once approved, step 6 is the ongoing reporting requirements. Once you incorporate, you need to organize the corporation, issue shares, organize the minute book, pass bylaws, draft any shareholders' agreements, and organize director and shareholder meetings. Finally, Freba and I simply wanted to mention that while we broadly covered the 3 most common types of business structures, if none seem like the right fit for your organization, there are other forms of entities to consider. For example, if you have a short-term project for a specific purpose, a joint venture agreement may be an idea. Or if you're an organization whose main objective is not the pursuit of profit, but instead a public purpose, a charity or nonprofit may be well suited. These are all options we can discuss further if anyone is interested. And other than that, I see some questions popping up. And I will either get to those and cover anything else that people would like.
So it's Freba here again. I see we have some time and I know questions are coming in. So while you guys are thinking of questions, there were a few other things that, while they're not listed in our PowerPoint, some general comments about when you start your business that we would like to cover since we have time. We can always add one more slide and circulate an updated PowerPoint for everybody. Some of those points, so when you start a business name registration is very important. As Jordan mentioned, when you are incorporating, you go through that step of reserving the name and then registering your or incorporating your business. So for corporations, the registration of the business name happens at that level. But if you are a sole proprietor or a partnership, you don't go through the business name reservation as a corporation. You still need to register your business name in order to operate under that business name. The registration is done still with the corporate registry, and it's not a very complicated step to follow. Again, you can do that yourself or have a lawyer do that for you, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. You'll also need to make sure you are registered for GST and PSD as needed, depending on your business. You may need to think about employment agreements if you are employing anybody to provide services for your business. And some of them, there might be situations where you're employing somebody as an employee, in which case you then need to make sure you are looking after all the wage deductions and whatnot. There might also be situations where you are hiring somebody as an independent contractor, and that would be a situation where we would highly recommend making sure there's an independent contractor agreement in place, because later on it could result in a lot of liability for you to CRA and also to that individual. You also need your business license, and you probably already know that. So if you're operating in Saskatoon, you need a license from City of Saskatoon. You also need to ensure that you are registered in other provinces if you are going to be operating in other provinces. Each province has their own requirement, but if you start your business, let's say in Saskatchewan, and then start selling in Alberta, you want to make sure you're extra provincially registered in Alberta in order to operate. Otherwise, you could get in trouble. I think that's all the other extra points we wanted to cover, and we will start addressing the questions.
What does have capacity mean? Under the legislation, capacity just means having the mental capacity to understand the decisions that you are making and the reasons that you are making them. Freba practices in wills and estates quite extensively, so maybe she can speak to that a little bit further.
Yeah, capacity for wills and estates is quite, the threshold is a lot higher than incorporating. So if I have a client that comes in the door and says they want to incorporate a business, and as long as I know they know what they're doing and understand the consequences of their decision, really, that's the extent of my inquiry. You could also just incorporate your business personally yourself, and there's no test, or corporate registry doesn't sit down with you to test your capacity. Capacity does not mean financial capacity either. So Kathleen also wanted to get a general estimate for startup paperwork to incorporate. Our office charges $1,000 in legal fees to incorporate your business. And this is to incorporate a straightforward, simple model. This does not include USA, so a unanimous shareholder agreement and whatnot. So that's our basic cost, I guess.
Carla's asking, what would you recommend for freelancing projects like fundraising for nonprofit and other marketing projects? Carla, I think that would depend on the circumstances. And we would probably need a little bit more information on what those projects are, how long-term they are, what are the risks involved, how are you going to how are you going to obtain funds, how are you actually going to keep people on board with the projects so they're not coming and going. Do you have any
well, because for nonprofits and charities, there are very specific requirements you have to meet in order to be registered as one. So I think we would need some more information. You might be able to register as a nonprofit, period, but it really depends on what your purpose is.
Registering as a nonprofit acts exactly the same as a corporation. So a nonprofit can be run as a sole proprietor, but you can also incorporate a nonprofit so that you have the same advantages and disadvantages as a corporation. The only difference is that you are incorporating under the Saskatchewan Nonprofit Corporations Act as opposed to the Saskatchewan Business Corporations Act. So with the nonprofit, you can basically take all the advantages and disadvantages of each business structure and plug them in to that entity to decide what's right for you.
Okay, Donna Ray would like us to go over the obligations post-incorporation. Basically, corporations, because they're separate legal entities, the directors, and in most small corporations, the shareholders are also the directors. They're obligated to keep proper records of the corporation. So there's something we call a minute book, where you put all the annual returns and all the resolutions and share certificates and all that. And all of that needs to be kept updated. There's also annual returns that must be filed with corporate registry, and there's costs involved with filing those. And if you don't file one, then your corporation gets struck off the registry. There's also separate income taxes that need to be filed because corporations are separate legal entities. So there's a separate income tax that needs to get filed, and obviously that could add to accounting costs.
The legislation requires you to have one annual general meeting a year as a corporation. So you need to make sure to be scheduling those annual general meetings. And based on the terms of appointment of your directors, you need to be sure to be reappointing directors for the next term, whatever that might be.
So Kathleen would like to know the cost for extra provincial registration, I'm assuming. And also, Donna would like to know the benefit of provincial incorporation versus federal. So extra provincial registration, it depends on the provinces. So a lot of the costs we're giving you, please remember that these are legal costs only. There's also corporate registry fees that need to get paid at every stage. And so those can also be different depending on the jurisdiction. For extra provincial registration, let's say you have a corporation that you have registered in Alberta and you come to us to register it in Saskatchewan. We charge, I believe, is it $350? So it's not a very, very high cost. It's cheaper, I guess, than cost of incorporation, but there's also corporate registry fees that need to get paid.
And there's also an agreement between the Western provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba.
Yeah, that's why the extra provincial registration is fairly simple.
Yeah,
but the costs are not as high.
Into Ontario, that's a whole nother complexity that we are not covering.
In terms of benefits of provincial incorporation versus federal, so it depends on what your business model is. We would say the main benefit of federally incorporating is the fact that your business name is covered across Canada, so nobody else can use that business name across Canada. Whereas if you incorporate in Saskatchewan under whatever business name you choose, somebody else in Alberta can take that business name, and then tomorrow if you want to go to Alberta, you may not be able to use that business name. But even if you're federally incorporated, you still, in each province that you are going to operate, you have to still be extra provincially registered.
Is there a document available that will list the registration requirements needed, i.e. PST, GST, etc.? I don't know if there is
there's a lot of information available on ISC website, which is basically the corporate registry website for Saskatchewan, ISC. So you will find a lot of the useful information, and sometimes topics may cover GST, PST as well, but a lot of the topics are based on how to incorporate and the steps of incorporating and whatnot. You could also find information on Sask Finance regarding PST and when you have to be registered for PST, and on CRA's website for GST. But if you're not sure whether you have to register for those, you can always consult an accountant. Okay, so Jasmine's question is, does 2 million liability insurance usually enough, or is personal assets most often taken when sued as a sole proprietorship? Do you want to take it? So the amount of liability insurance, we can't tell you exactly what's the sufficient amount because it really depends on your business and how much exposure you have to liability. For a lot of small businesses, a couple of $1 million for the most part is okay, but it depends on your industry. In terms of whether that's enough to cover you and prevent your personal assets from being registered against, that also really depends, because if I'm suing somebody and their insurance is not paying me, I can still go after their personal assets, because with insurance, it really depends whether it will cover you or not. But also, so as long as I'm paid from insurance, I don't have the ability to then sue you. But if I'm not sufficiently paid by the insurance, then I can still go after your personal assets, basically.
Carla's asking, where would I get this kind of info? I have done fundraising with a university, so I'm taking my experience to help organizations with campaign strategies, almost always short term.
What's related to that?
Yeah, Carla, it sounds like you are operating as a sole proprietor. What you might want to consider is actually signing independent contract agreements with the people that you go to set up these campaign strategies with.
I would also suggest, Carla, that you contact us directly. Maybe it's a conversation we can have offline, just because we don't really have a lot of information. So feel free to contact Jordan and I, and we can get some more information, and we can do a phone call free of charge for you as well, just so we are giving you the right information. So we'll move on to the next question. If I sell my products globally online, would it be best to register federally? Yes and no, because you have to meet with requirements in the global markets where you are operating your business. So you can just be a Saskatchewan registered company and sell your goods globally. It doesn't stop you from doing that. The only advantage of being federally registered is really to make sure your name is kind of reserved across the country. But otherwise, if you're operating globally, you want to make sure you are meeting the requirements of those global markets where you're operating.
And if you have your office, your head office in Saskatchewan, you can just as easily register provincially. What are the qualities of an independent contractor? So this kind of enters into the realm of employment and labor law, which neither Freba or I practice in. But for those of you who do not know, there's an independent contractor and there's an employee. And these are two completely different positions. So where an employer is responsible for an employee and remitting GST and for occupational safety purposes, et cetera, an independent contractor is somebody that you hire, but they maintain legally they're completely separate from the employer.
Yeah, they can be a sole proprietor or a corporation providing services. Some of the main, sorry Jordan to cut you off, some of the main differences are for independent, so you still have to, it could depend on different situations, but some of the main differences is who has control of the hours of the employee versus independent contractor, whether the person is able to provide services to others or just employed by you,
who owns the assets,
who owns the tools. So for example, if you provide them with the office, with the computer, and they come in there and work 9 to 5, then they could really potentially be an employee. So those are some of the main factors. Also, whether they are responsible for the risks. So if 1 year your business is not doing well and they don't get to make as much, are you going to top them up? Because with employees, if you're keeping them, you pay them the full salary regardless of how your business is doing. With independent contractors, they really get paid what they're hired to do. So a lot of those factors are the main factors, but you really want to about that before you decide whether the person is an independent contractor, because it doesn't matter whether you call them an independent contractor or not. And a lot of times, even if you have an independent contractor agreement, it doesn't really matter because CRA goes back to the main differences to decide. Yeah, the nature of the relationship in order to decide. Can you please elaborate on sole proprietors needing to have independent contractor agreements with their suppliers if they use freelancers? If they're suppliers, then really you need a supplier agreement, not an independent contractor agreement, because all they're doing is supplying you with goods or perhaps services. But that's how I see it. If they're providing services, then perhaps they could fall in under the independent contractor situation, and then you would need an independent contractor agreement.
I just want to elaborate too. Independent contractors and employees are something you need to be careful about because, as Freba said, it doesn't matter what you think, it's the nature of the relationship itself. So if you're hiring somebody who you categorize as an independent contractor but is actually an employee, and you as the employer are not holding back source deductions, and then CRA comes back at you 5 years later to say, hey, this is an employee, not an independent contractor, you as the employer are going to be liable for those 5 years of source deductions that you were not holding back because they were actually an employee and not an independent contractor. I believe, Christine, if I am a consultant that works solely out of SK, but many of my clients that I serve are in other provinces and in the US as well, I am incorporated and have contracts with each of my clients. Do I need to register with each province? Christine, that's another question that you might have to call us afterwards to get some more information. Whether you have to register extra-provincially depends on the level of business that you are doing in another province.
Yeah, because different provinces have requirements under their legislation as to whether you're required to register or not. For Saskatchewan, if you're operating a business and it's pretty broadly defined, you're required to be registered here. a lot of provinces can be quite similar. So we can chat with you offline about that as well if you wish.
You can request a ruling by CRA. I just requested a ruling and was audited. Oh yes, Kathleen. I deal quite a bit with nonprofits. Usually my recommendation is actually not to request a ruling by CRA. It sort of just gives a red flag to CRA to follow up with you after the fact. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be complying. As you want to meet the requirements as they come, but requesting a ruling just sort of puts your name as a red flag from CRA.
So we'll give it a few minutes to see if there are any other questions. And I believe we've covered all the questions so far, but if we've missed any, please let us know.
Thank you, Kathleen.
So Angie would like to know if there is a limit to how many employees a sole proprietorship can have, and I would say no, there's no limit. You can go crazy, just make sure you have the right agreements with your employees in place. So Angie would like us to sum up key considerations on whether to incorporate or not. And I guess if you go to that corporation slide, which is slide 9 of our presentation, you can basically see the advantages and disadvantages. For the most part, it's tax with corporations, as Jordan has mentioned. In most situations, you can do some sort of tax planning and also be able to pay a lower rate of tax and liability. So with corporations, you can limit your liability, which means if somebody is suing the business, they can only go after the assets of the corporation. Really, those are the two big questions for a lot of businesses. Of course, there's the costs of incorporating. The initial costs are high and the ongoing costs. So sometimes it's just not worth the cost if your business is very, very small and you just don't want to incur those costs. But for the most part, those are the main things to consider.
Yeah, and the costs, well, they're not substantial if you have a huge net profit. If you run a small nail business or the campaign business that somebody had spoken to in the chat, the ongoing filing fees and the extra $300 each year and the $1,000 to incorporate it adds up pretty quick. Where when you're running some types of business, the limited liability isn't as big of a consideration. So roofing business, yeah, there's a lot of risk, but what's a business that would be low risk from liability perspective?
We're lawyers, we can't think positively at all. I don't know, maybe an alterations business.
Yeah.
You can only really screw up a dress, and depending on how expensive that dress is, you're exposed to that much in cost, but it depends. We don't see anybody typing, so I think there might not be any more questions here. We would both like to thank Women's Entrepreneurs for letting us present to you guys today, and thanks to all of you. You've been really, really awesome. And have a good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, well, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Freba and Jordan for taking the time out of their crazy days to share some of their insights with us. This webinar taught us some important things to consider when debating to incorporate our business. I know I've learned a lot today. I also want to say thank you to everyone that was able to join us today. Our next upcoming webinar is titled Conscious Leadership, Becoming the Leader That You Are Meant to Be, and it is presented by Paula Hobrich. So check your WESC emails, or you can always visit our WESC website to register. Bye, everybody, and have a great afternoon.